Shabbat shalom, everyone. We're going to begin our Shiur. I see more and more people filtering in from the hallway with their plates. We're going to begin our Shiur because we're going to try to wrap it up around 2-ish, let's just say. And Gil will teach and open it up to questions from the congregation. It is a pleasure to hand over the microphone to scholar, to our teacher, Gil Troy.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for all you did to organize and to host and to welcome me. It's really been amazing, and it's another chapter in what I hope will be a very long-standing friendship, and it's already been a very deep and inspiring friendship. And again, thank you to all of you. I want to do 3 things in the 3 hours we have remaining. Don't worry. I respect the clock. I want us to literally turn the page, because you'll see I have lots of stuff about the way to fight for Israel, and we'll get to that. But I want us to start by going to page 3. Because, and I thought of redoing it, but I said, no, I want us to physically turn the page, because it's so easy to get swept up into the dynamics of the fight and how, as I was saying from the Bima both days, how unjust it is. So let's start by taking a few minutes and just breathing a little and thinking about Zionism. And we're going to start with one somewhat longish text, because it's the text that as soon as October 7th happened, I turned to. And frankly, I know how amazing this community has been in supporting our friends John and Rachel, whose son Hirsch, we know lost part of his arm, and we haven't heard anything since. And I sent this text to them too. And we had an email exchange about it. So maybe somebody wants to read. It's called The Building Blocks of Identity Zionism, Gershon Shaked, No Other Place. This is the audience participation part of our program. There have to be at least 1 or 2 people from the business, former actors, future actors. Go for it.
On November November 1938, a 9-year-old boy was alone in a large apartment on Respectable Street in Vienna. His mother had gone out.
Stop. I'm going to keep on interrupting you. So he's living the German dream. He's living the Austrian dream. He's living the Herzl dream. He's living the Enlightenment dream. He's living our dream. Go.
His father had been deported to a concentration camp. The boy did not know there was rioting out. Sensing the approaching dust by the shadows on the street wall, he crawled under the piano in a corner.
So again, we also see signs of respectability. Right? He has a piano in his apartment in Vienna, and the apartment is grand enough, you imagine, so he doesn't even hear the rioting in the street. So imagine the scene. Imagine the success, the comfort that the Jews then had. Go.
To calm his fears, he played. He tried to take refuge in fantasy, but his fear overwhelmed him. There was shouting on the floor above. He turned on all the lights and put 2 chairs against the front door. Soon there was knocking. The boy was afraid to open the door. When the men came bursting in, he did not know where to hide. None of the tricks he had learned from his books were of any help. Finally, he crawled back under the piano.
So again, his books, his fantasies, the piano. This is true enlightenment. This is the best of the best. This is Europe at its absolute best and, very quickly, worst. Go.
The boy never saw the men's faces, only their 5 pair of boots. Taking no interest of him, they emptied the apartment of its contents, rugs and paintings, silver and finally furniture, piece by piece. It was only when they turned to the piano that they noticed the child clinging to one of its legs. They worked him over with their boots. They said and did things that the boy does not want to remember. When it was all over, the boy curled up within himself, surrounded by the bare walls of the now empty apartment. He could not turn on the lights because the raiders had taken all the bulbs? Huddled in that darkness.
Just stop right there. So think about it. Now we're at this moment of, we've gone in seconds, this young man has gone from living the life to utter despair. And I read that because it reminded me of October 7th. On October 7th, they're preparing kites in Kibbutz Be'eri to celebrate a peace connection with the people of Gaza. On October 7th, they're prepared, if they're religious, to celebrate Simchat Torah. On October 7th, they're living a beautiful life. And then within seconds, They're thrust back into what I said last night, the worst moments of Jewish history and the evil. And they don't just want to take things, but they want to take away our dignity. And that's why they had to broadcast and film the unspeakable horrors that they now deny happened. Because they wanted to rob us of our dignity, rob us of our sense of self. But they can't do it. They'll never do it. Continue.
Huddled in that darkness, mortified and alone, the boy discovered his own private kind of Zionism. How different it was from the Zionism of those pioneers in the sunny fields of the Jezreel Valley. It was Tolstoy who said, "All happy families are alike, and only the miserable families differ from one another." The normal lives of children from Switzerland to New Zealand are all alike. The fate of the Jewish children in the 1940s from the banks of the Volga to the English Channel differ.
Stop, I'm going to interrupt you again. And then I thought, especially October 7th, 8th, 9th, about those children who had been taken. And we still haven't found the two Bibas children. How could it be that we were waking up in a world? How could it be that we're still waking up in a world where Jews are in dungeons simply because they're Jews? Young, old, didn't matter. Senile. How could it be? And so we all joined Jewish history on October 7th. Those of us who've been trying to run away from it. Right? Think about it. So many of our feminist friends on campus on October 5th said, wow, they have a very strong identity. They're very proud of their feminism. Maybe we Jews could learn about their identities. And too many feminists on October 7th, denied their core commitments to silence is violence, to Me Too, to listen to every woman. And so many young Jews who were distant, who didn't even know it was Simchat Torah, understood, as this boy understood. They discovered their own private kind of Zionism. Continue.
Each has his or her own tragic tale. The answer to this question can be found by asking a larger question. What is Eretz Yisrael to those cultured European Jews for whom history has decreed exile? Is it not some kind of devil's island to which history expelled them while they, like Dreyfus in his time, longed to get back to the European motherland, to have their honor restored, to regain their positions in the cultural avant-garde?
There's a tension sometimes in Zionism. If Zionism is only anti-Semitism, if Zionism today is only anti-Zionism, we lose. And these people, some of these people saying there were some people who were living with him in Israel, who were refugees from Europe, who were still stuck in Europe, still yearning to return, longing for that lost Europe, longing for that beautiful apartment in Vienna. But no, Zionism teaches us that we defend ourselves, but we also move on, transcend, dream, built and get rebuilt. Go.
Y.H. Brenner in From Here and From There, 1911, wrote in pessimistic tones of the Jewish people, Eretz Yisrael, and their interrelations. He was forced to conclude, nevertheless, that although it may be impossible to live here, there is no other place. I too lost the foundations of my existence. Yet despite my own ambivalences, the longings for the West, the love for and aversion to the Eretz Yisrael of today, it seems to me that the commitment must be unequivocal.
Okay, I'm stopping now. So Gershon Shaked is the writer. His Shaked is almond in Hebrew, and he was born in a good Viennese family, and he is that boy. And then he goes on to become a great cultural critic at Hebrew University. And he's saying, I understand the ambivalence because I'm so in that European world, but no. And he's saying he's also a very harsh left-wing critic of the Eretz Yisrael, of the Medinat Yisrael, of the state of Israel as it is in 1980 when he's writing. But nevertheless, repeat what you just read.
The longings for the West, the love for and aversion to the Eretz Yisrael of today, it all seems to me that the commitment must be unequivocal.
We have to know who we are, and we have to be committed. Continue.
I would argue that once the ground is destroyed, there is no recovering it. To the extent that identity depends on consciousness, a person has no choice but to decide. And if one has fled the ruins of Sodom, there is no other place but here.
Ein makom acher. There is no other place but here. We don't give up. Our commitment must be unequivocal. We have to understand that we can't go back. And unfortunately, we can't go back to October 6th. So our challenge is, how do we make today better and tomorrow even better? How do we learn from the awful lessons and the traumas and the failures and the weaknesses and the division and move on? And what I love about this text is it sits with us and it sits with the pain. And it doesn't go happy-dappy on us. But Gershon Shaket went on to become an Israel Prize winner. Gershon Shaket went on to raise a family in Israel. And I think it's very important to understand that he didn't allow himself to be defined only by that awful day. Never be defined by your worst memories. Never be defined by your worst moment. One of the things that I find powerful about Zionism, it's a critique and it's a rejection of a lot of what we're starting to see in American society, of what Jonathan Haidt calls the coddling of the American mind, of the snowflaking. There's a toughness, because, as I tried to say to the young bat mitzvah girl today, if you realize that you don't just count in decades, don't just count in centuries, but count in millennia and count in eternity, if you're part of something bigger, you don't let yesterday's upset or today's even trauma, I'm not afraid of that word, define you. You move on. And so my first part of today, and I want to thank you for putting up with my interruptions, is the Zionist part, where Theodore Roosevelt himself, Theodore Herzl himself, I was thinking Theodore and I saw we talked about Roosevelt, so it's both of your faults. Theodore Herzl himself said that Zionism is a double revolution. We're not only going to establish a state, but we're going to get rid of the Yid within, the broken Jew. The American Revolution was to get rid of the British. The French Revolution was to get rid of the king. The Soviet Revolution was to get rid of the Tsar. But the Zionist Revolution was to create a new Jew, not just a new Jewish homeland. And that new Jew, those new Jews, are the ones who save us on October 7th. I had the tremendous privilege on Purim. I'll take you in 1 second. I'll just tell the story and then I'll ask your question, and I'll take your question. Herzl, new Jew. Right, so Herzl was on his own journey, right? I spent a long time sitting with Herzl, right, and putting these 3 volumes together. And you can certainly see where there are certain things he missed. He actually thought, unlike what I said today, he thought that Zionism would truly cure the world of anti-Semitism, right? And I've gone beyond Herzl and said, wait a minute, I want to take on the burden of curing anti-Semitism? That's for them. What I want to do is I want to give us tools to fight against anti-Semitism. And Herzl himself was on his identity journey, because he, in his famous story, The Menorah, talks about how a man in his 40s with children brings a menorah into his home for the first time in his life. But with each light, he starts with 2 candles, and the next night 3, 4. What does he do? He brings more light in. And so he was learning about the power of Eretz Yisrael. He was learning about the power of Jewish identity. And he was learning about the power of the 2 revolutions. You have to build a state, but you also have to rebuild the Jew. And he died when he was 44, so we don't know where he would have ended up. So I agree with you that he had, you can grade him on where he was wrong, but you can also say, wow, given where we were in 1897, when he issued Der Judenstaat, pretty darn prophetic. And I love the fact, Der Judenstaat was 1896. I love the fact that in 1897, when he did the Zionist Congress, he said, 50 years from now, we're going to have a Jewish state, and he was off by 1 year. So he's not the most perfect prophet, but that's pretty darn good, and a lot better than Gil Troy. So this opens up the texts, and this is going to be your homework to read because we don't have time, and I'm just trying to give you a little taste of how to think about it. So we start with that traumatic journey, and then the texts afterwards don't go back to trauma, but go forward. Beryl Katznelson writes this amazing thing, Revolution and Tradition, where he says, what's the most important skill? 2 skills. We need to remember and we need to forget. If we don't know how to remember, our kids are lost. If we don't know how to remember, we have no roots. If we don't know how to remember, we don't have that amazing gift that we all gave to Annalisa today. But if you only remember and don't have the skill of forgetting, you can't go as Herzl did out of the box. You can't build Startup Nation. You can't innovate. And we know we have some Jews who only remember and forget a little bit. And we have some Jews who are so busy just forgetting that they are un-Jews. I was talking with some of you in the pews. They're undoing the core consensus about Israel and the Jewish people. They're undoing the lessons of Jewish history. And so, like always, there's no easy formula. We need a balance. And Golda Meir leans into the fact that even then, in 1958, when she's celebrating the 10th anniversary of this miracle called Israel, that nationalism sometimes is seen as ugly. But think about it. Nationalism, right? I know nationalism is a complicated word in America today. Nationalism is a neutral tool. In the 1940s, German Jews experienced nationalism at its absolute worst, i.e. Nazism. And in 1948, our parents and grandparents experienced, and some of us experienced nationalism at its most elevating, i.e. Zionism. Nationalism isn't good or bad. It's a tool that we use. My nationalism has a first name and a middle name, liberal democratic nationalism. And Golda Meir's did too. And Zionism is liberal democratic nationalism one form, and American nationalism is a different form of liberal democratic nationalism. And Natan Sharansky talks about the recovery of his identity and understanding who he is. And he said, only by understanding who I was could I fight for my human rights. And Nelson Mandela says the same thing in his autobiography. Until I found my people, until I found my roots, I couldn't fight for freedom. And David Hartman says something so important, which is so important today. And in fact, in the Parsha today, they talk about us as an Eidah. We're a machaneh sometimes, or an Eidah sometimes. A machaneh is a camp. And I always think of like the covered wagons, huddled, right? On October 7th, we were a camp. We were attacked, and we all went into our trauma zones and into our protective zone, into our solidarity zone. But our greatness is we're not just defined by Yetziat Mitzrayim, leaving Egypt. We're defined by getting the law and getting a vision. And Eidah comes from Ed, from witness. Get a vision of who we can be. And he says, we will mourn forever because of the memory of Auschwitz. We won't forget, never again. But we will build a healthy new society because of the memory of Sinai. Never alone. And then Roifi talks about some of the challenges. She's an American writer who talks about her own failures she feels as a parent because she gave her kid so much of a beautiful universal message that they weren't rooted in their Jewish story. And Ruth Gavison says something really powerful, which is liberalism is not about being a thin person, which he means is somebody who has a thin identity. We need thickness. We need connectedness. And so I just wanted to start off literally by forcing us to turn the page and think about the journey. Think about the journey we've been on. Think about the journey we want our children to be on. And think of the journey and take some of these texts and incorporate them into your Passover Seder. Make sure that this Seder is memorable because of the conversations you have about Israel, because of the conversations you have about values, because of the conversations you have about, as I said earlier, your own personal stories. Cleansing breath? Questions, comments?
I wanted to ask you a question about the story that is told to American Jews. It comes from the media for the most part, and I want to know what to do with the New York Times. I can't just say I'm going to disregard it because it is what the people in power in this country read. A few years ago, we hosted Bret Stephens. And I asked him this question. It was just when he had switched from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times. I said, does your current employer get Israel right? His response was, I get it right. And I said to him, you didn't answer my question. He said, I answered the question that I'm going to answer. What do you do about the New York Times?
I know we love to complain about our youth these days, but one thing we can take solace in is that fewer and fewer young kids read the New York Times, right? We used to sit around and saying, oh my goodness, they don't read the New York Times. Thank God they don't read the New York Times, right? Now, unfortunately, it's much, much worse than that. Unfortunately, we're not just talking about the New York Times. We're talking about we right now are in the center of what I call a sanctimony cyclone. Look at the bottom of page 2. And I mentioned this last night too. 3,673 articles about Gaza from October 7th to March 26th in the New York Times. 80 articles about the Mosul invasion, which America was intimately involved in from October to October 2016 to July 2017. So I wish it was only Thomas Friedman in the New York Times. And by the way, I love reading Thomas Friedman because I then know what not to believe and what not to say. It's very clarifying. But this obsession with him, right? And his cab drivers, right? Those were, I was in Dubai and I spoke to the cab driver. Thanks a lot. So, we need to laugh at it because otherwise we'd cry. But you're absolutely right. We live in a world which worships the New York Times. And part of it is we've raised our kids to worship the New York Times in the same way that we've raised our kids to worship the universities. One of the reasons why there's so much pain in the American Jewish community today is because the overwhelming majority of American Jews worship in the liberal temples, worship in the Democratic Party, worship in the universities, worship the New York Times. That is read far more frequently, sorry to say, Rabbi, by more American Jews every day than the Bible. It is the American Jewish Bible. So I can't undo it. All I can do is what I call Pilates, try to strengthen our core. The more we can understand and read through it, the more we raise our kids to read it critically, the more we raise our kids to understand that, yes, CNN may be obsessed with it, but how come it's so disproportionate? And shift the conversation to why is there this disproportionate focus on Israel, on the Jew? Let's go back into history and teach our kids to think not just in the tweet of the moment or the X of the moment, but to think deeper. Think in those decades, think in the centuries. It's not a great answer, right? But it's the condition that we're stuck with. And again, we have a choice. We can be paralyzed by despair. We can oi gewalt till the cows come home. Or we can start thinking more critically about how do we give our kids some critical tools to push back. Yes, hi. Or we can read the world, right? So we're hearing that we should read the Wall Street Journal. Part of it also is we have to be better media consumers. We have to read more broadly. And now in the age of the internet, it's easy. You can read the Jerusalem Post. You can read the Times of Israel. You can read, if you're talking about American politics, I read Real Clear Politics, right? Because it's an aggregator. And what's depressing to me about Real Clear Politics, it puts together left, right. You can see by the title which way the argument is going. It's so boring. It's so tedious for everybody to be so predictable. I like people who surprise me. I like a little complexity. But given the reality, we try to start becoming better consumers, and it's very important to share the information we have. So now, what I want to do is I want to go to some of the, yeah. Let's go to questions. Sure, of course.
This is a little more somber question. So
Okay.
I've heard a number of people sort of articulate this theory that since 1945, things have gotten better for Jews almost every year, so to speak. And that it was sort of this vaccination, if you will, post-Holocaust that sort of tamped down anti-Semitism because of, to some degree, world guilt of what happened. And that now we've gotten to the point in time, almost 80 years later, where that doesn't work anymore, and that we're in this new reality where the vaccine is essentially worn off. I was wondering what your thoughts on that are.
So it's interesting, when you speak extemporaneously, you have three speeches. You have the speech you prepare, the speech you give, and the speech you walk away saying, darn, I wish I should have said that. And today also, because I saw it was a bat mitzvah, I went a little lighter and a little less substantive. But one of the stories I was going to tell, so you've given me an opportunity to tell now, is tied to Encino. And it's tied actually to Salman Schechter School of Queens, where Mitch Gossett and I first met many years ago. Because we grew up in the world of the post-Auschwitz covenant. We grew up in a world where we were told that we could be whoever we want. And I was saddled with this weirdo named Gilad. Most of my friends were literally named Richard and Mitchell and Gary because that was the great gift of America. You could fit in, you could belong. And I used to have great arguments with my grandfather, Alav Shalom, who was from Poland, who they said, walk down the street, nobody said there's a white guy, they said there's a Yid. And he said he saw anti-Semites behind every tree. And I said, Gramps, you're wrong. America's different, and the world learns its lessons. And for me, it didn't happen on October 7th. For me, it happened when Daniel Pearl was kidnapped. When Daniel Pearl was kidnapped, and his father, Judea Pearl, who's an amazing man, who's one of my teachers and my heroes, and lives somewhere in the hills of Encino, which I don't really know what that means, because I just took an Uber here and I have no idea where the heck I am. But anyway, when Daniel Pearl was kidnapped, And he was kidnapped as a Wall Street Journal reporter, but he was beheaded, this is why I chose not to talk about it this morning, as a Jew. And I forced myself, even though the family asked us not to, I forced myself to watch the snuff video, where he was forced to say, my name is Daniel Pearl, my father is a Jew, I am a Jew, and they killed him. And I did it because I was living in La La Land and not your La La Land. I was living disconnected. My grandfather was unfortunately right. I learned in 2002. And my students said to me, what kind of an idiot was he? What kind of a fool was he going down the pathway of a madrasah for an interview, for a story, really? I was exactly that kind of idiot because we were quadruply protected. Daniel Pearl was born in 1967. I was born in 1971. Daniel Pearl went off to Stanford. I went off to Harvard. Daniel Pearl became a reporter. I became a professor. Daniel Pearl had the Wall Street Journal behind him. I had McGill University behind us. We were Americans. We were quintuply protected. We had the insulation. We had transcended history. We were in a new era. And 9/11, and what the Palestinians call the Second Intifada, made it clear to me how deep the hatred went. And when they killed and beheaded Daniel Pearl as a Jew, and when I didn't see the broad disgust in the American community against that, people went nod, but it didn't hit them. It changed my life. And it's part of the reason why I ended up in Israel. It's part of the reason why I became a Zionist activist. It's part of the reason why I started continuing my job as an American historian, but also leading as a Zionist. And by the way, after October 7th, when I was on an email chat, because we're too old to have a WhatsApp chat, so it was an email group with my Harvard roommates, and when my Harvard roommates read the legal suit that's been filed by 4 Harvard students against Harvard for anti-Semitism, Michael Mattis of Scarsdale High, from the time he was 14 years old, did everything he could to get into Harvard, went to Harvard with his high school sweetheart, got married 3 days after graduation. The last time I saw them, Judy, whom I love, his wife, said, "Oh, we have a Jewish trifecta. We have a doctor, a lawyer, and a businessman." And I wanted to say, what about their souls? What about their value? But I put it aside because I'm good. But we have to think about, as I said yesterday, the messaging we give our own kids. He read the indictment and he cried. He cried not only because he felt empathy for those students who went through humiliation, but he cried because of what you're feeling, that this might be the end of an era. And some of you may have read that article about the golden age of American Jewry is ending. But I'm a Zionist. I don't accept that, right? I should be delighted. Say, oh, great, America sucks, America's falling apart, come on over to Israel. That's not my Zionism. As a Zionist, I'm saying to you, and I'm saying to the next generation, I said it in the university campuses where I spoke today, and in the high schools I spoke today, we have to make it better. Why? Because we have to learn from Martin Luther King. We have to learn that we have to call America out to be as great America as it can be, to live up to its ideals. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but that's the challenge of the moment. Yes?
Yeah, Gil, on that point, UNRWA has got to be dealt with. And I think that's something that we have got to get behind because it was not meant to be what it is, what it has been.
So fortunately, the ground is shifting a little bit. UNRWA is the United Nations Welfare and Relief Association that was established in 1948. It started in 1940, but really started formally in 1950 to just deal with the temporary problem of the Palestinian refugees. Now, we have a problem. There's this thing called a refugee. And what a refugee means is when you're fleeing from war, or it could also be from catastrophe. It's a temporary status. We in Israel, what do we call refugees? Citizens. Right. 850,000 Jews were kicked out of Arab lands and Muslim lands, and they were temporarily refugees, but they're our brothers and sisters. They came home. After World War II, there were tens of millions of refugees in the world. Not one of them has inherited status except for the Palestinians. Now, on top of that, the Palestinians call out Nakba, catastrophe. On November 29th, 1947, the United Nations made a partition First of all, it recognized the state of the right of the Jewish people to have a state and our connectedness to this land because we are the original Aboriginal people. We were the ones who put the in indigeneity. We're connected to that land. It's so much a part of our land. We're still singing the same songs, speaking the same language, rooted in the same Bible. Nobody with some phrase about settler colonialism can take that away from us. And in 1947, there was a compromise and the Palestinians said no. Do you know within 3-4 months of the rejection of that compromise, November 1947, we're not even at May 1948 yet, over 300 Jews had been slaughtered by Palestinians trying to change that status quo, trying to undermine that compromise. And then in May 1948, when the British lowered the flag and we raised the Jewish flag, the Palestinian irregulars, and by the way, in the old days, you called Palestinians also Palestinian Jews, right? I had a father-in-law who was a Romanian Jew who lived in Israel for a few years, and he had a Palestinian passport. He said, I am Palestinian, in his heavy Russian and Romanian accent. So, but now they became the Palestinians, right? But they're really the Palestinian Arabs. Their armies joined up with 6 other Arab armies to annihilate us. And they failed. And we won. And that's their catastrophe? Their catastrophe is they tried to get rid of us and they wouldn't accept the compromise. The catastrophe isn't that we exist and that we stole land from them. And UNRWA perpetuates this lie by A, giving refugee status to generation after generation after generation, B, not telling them like what the Zionists understood is solve the problem. And C, we've seen more recently that UNRWA not only was teaching in UNRWA kindergartens, what I called last night killer gardens, ugly math equations of if you kill 2 Jews and then 3 and you kill 3 others, what's the answer? How many Jews dead? And not only that, but on October 7th, at least a dozen, and I looked into this, and it's in the Wall Street Journal, so it's true, but it was also in Israeli intelligence, at least a dozen UNRWA teachers and social workers, and I'm putting those in really big quotation marks, participated in the massacre. Killed, raped, pillaged. And finally, we heard the Canadians, the Norwegians, the Americans say, maybe this isn't the best idea. But this, by the way, is typical activism for you to do. I see tremendous power in this room. All of you have computers. All of you have networks. All of you know people. We need to put pressure on the American governments to make sure that we don't just become sheep and that we use this moment to change it. Yes?
But UNRWA is, look, everything, there were, as you said, tens of millions of refugees. UNRWA was supposed to be a 2-year deal.
Right.
So when the Palestinian children are taught, they're taught, well, the United States is funding it, the United Nations has blessed it, and the books have got all the lies that are being, taught. That's why you've got the problem that we've got. We've got to fight it. We've got to end it. Okay, now that I believe that's got to be a major, responsibility that we have.
But I agree with you. But I think what's really interesting is everybody's always saying, well, what's the Israeli government going to do? And I'm saying this is something that the American Jewish community should be doing, right? I think there are all kinds of things the American Jewish community should be doing, right? I think the American Jewish community should be changing the language from bring them back to shlach et ami, free my people, now. I think the American Jewish community should be protesting every Qatari embassy and every Qatari consulate. I think the American Jewish community should be paying for the hostage families. And by the way, there are the hostage families and other hostage families, because not everybody, there's disagreement among the hostage families, right? But we in Israel are careful not to criticize them. But we have to bring hostage families and let them lead rallies here against the Qataris and put pressure on them. Here against the embassies that are facilitating this insanity. To yell and scream in Tel Aviv doesn't do anything. And in fact, it only makes, it sends the price up higher. Some of you are business people, you know negotiation. If we stepped away and said, this is the world's problem, not our problem, right? When we fought the Soviet Jewish movement, we said, free them now. Let my people go. Don't bring them home. It wasn't Israel's problem. Israel did what it could behind the scenes. So there's a whole inversion. We're all upside down. But I think American Jewish leaders, I'm sorry to say, have not been aggressive enough, have not been out of the box enough. I think you have to start and we have an amazing organizational network. Let's use it. And let's really start thinking about how do we push back. Yesterday, I talked about the need to raise a new generation of kids who doesn't get pushed around. who understands that as important as to be popular, it's more important to be right and proud and rooted and free, which is an American ideal, as well as a Jewish and Zionist and Israeli ideal. But I think you, as the leadership, have to really start sitting down with your leaders and saying, how do we change the narrative? How do we change the conversation? And even if we don't get it, even if we don't win, we'll at least have been on the right side of history. Yes, other questions? Sure.
Okay.
I'm going to let you call on people and pass the microphone around. Yeah, go.
I just want to say I've been you might think I'm crazy, but I am literally been researching 2 to 3 hours a day on the whole situation. History, a lot about Islam, difference between Islamism and Islam, looking at anti-Semitism, looking at everything. And what I wanted to offer today was, because I was here last night, that a solution that you don't hear about, but is out there. And by the way, YouTube is really a great source for everything, both sides, everything. Okay, so people go to YouTube. Is that I have found 3 sources. One of the gentlemen who was part of making the airdrop was a Palestinian. He actually went to high school here in the United States. His father was a doctor. He became a businessman. It was like, why don't you become a doctor? I was just the same thing. I'm going to offer something that I think you need to hear.
So what's the suggestion?
Okay, one, here's a human being who is a business person who has ideas about what to do after the war is over. Saudi Arabia, also because back in 2003, they had to fight off the Wahhabis. They went in and destroyed the printing presses. They got rid of Islamism. They have offered to Israel to go in after the war and get rid of the state of mind. Because after we get rid of the military problem, we're still left with the idealism problem. And not all Palestinians do feel like that. A lot of them miss the old days. But how many? Who knows? But we do know the children are being taught to hate children from a very, very young age. I hate Jews. But we can use the Saudi Arabians. We can use moderate Muslims. I have found one. They don't speak up enough. There are some solutions out there that we're not aware of.
I agree with you. I think we, even in Haaretz last week, Amira Haas, who usually is very, very harshly anti-Israel, ran an article quoting Palestinians who were fed up with Hamas. And I think we have to, don't buy the propaganda. Most Palestinians, first of all, celebrated on October 7th and continue to celebrate October 7th as a great day. So I have a hard time talking about how many innocents there are. But let me finish. But most Palestinians also are not stupid and don't look at this some kind of victory. They see what's happened in Gaza and they don't want it. The Saudi Arabians and the Egyptians started talking to the Israelis, not because all of a sudden they discovered the Talmud and started quoting it and learning that they loved Israel, but they feared the Iranians more. And frankly, they were also a little scared by Barack Obama's foreign policy. And so all of a sudden, we started having movements, shifts in geopolitics. So I absolutely agree with you. I think, and this is more important for the American foreign policy leadership and for the Israeli leadership, to start leaning in to find those sources in the Arab world. The word I most hate in the English language is the. Right? The Palestinians, the Arab world, because it doesn't listen to the people on the edges. It doesn't listen to the people on the inside. So I absolutely thank you for your suggestions. And my name is on, my email's on this. Feel free to pass them on. I'll pass them on however I can too. Yes, in the back.
I'm not sure how to frame the question, so I apologize to Mark. It seems to me that we're all very naive, or many of us are very naive, in that we don't look at this as a tribal issue. In 1922, if I have the date correctly, the British gave 80% of Palestine to one Arab tribe, the Hashemites, which is 80% of Palestine. And since then, the Muslims in that area are very fractured. A lot of it is tribal, a lot of it is religious. It's interesting that one of the reasons we have all these refugees is, whereas the Israelis said, hey, you lived in Libya, Jew, You lived in Tunisia. Come be a citizen of Israel. The Arab countries did not do that. They took in the Palestinians. They said, you live in a camp. You are not allowed in our cities. You are not allowed to be citizens. You are not allowed to be part of our society. Today, Egypt will not open their border. If some of you have seen the pictures of the border between Gaza and Egypt, it looks 5 times worse than the border that Texas is building, right, with Mexico. And it's like, why? Because they don't want them, because they're part of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood basically destroyed Egypt 10 years ago. And so there is this hatred between the various Arab groups, and the only thing that can unite them is the hatred of Israel. So with that, it's very complex. For sure. We want to simplify it. So I wanted your input as to...
So again, we have to be so aware of the, right? Because we overgeneralize and we oversimplify. But if we go back to October 6th, one of the positive rays of sunshine we were looking at was, is there some kind of Saudi Arabian breakthrough? Is that going to build on the Abraham Accords? And one of the theories, everybody has different theories, but one of the theories of why Hamas chose that particular timing was because they wanted to undermine any possibility of any kind of Saudi Arabian peace, and they wanted to lash out against the Abraham Accords. So part of the problem right now is that the Israeli leadership is so reactive and so stuck in today. As I argued yesterday, they're not thinking about the day after and they're not thinking about tomorrow. And what we need is, and as I said earlier, as I said also yesterday, that we have too many American foreign policy experts, quote unquote experts, who are so stuck in the conceptia that they don't understand their own conceptions. And everybody's yelling and screaming about how the Israelis failed. And unless we in America demand that our foreign policy experts, that our foreign policy establishment, that the State Department look at where they went wrong on October 7th, the mistakes they made, the misreadings they made. People talk about the Palestinians. For years I've been saying this. Jenin has a different tribal dynamic than Hebron. And that's a different tribal dynamic than Gaza. And I actually think that's why we should start working with the clans in Gaza, not thinking they were going to be democratic. But go back to the 1980s. One of the big mistakes, again, Western conceptia, with the Oslo peace process, was that by bringing Arafat back from Tunisia, Yasser Arafat was in exile in Tunisia. Oh, great. Well, because he speaks to the UN, he must represent the Palestinian people. At the time, there were 4 West Bank Arab mayors who were far more pragmatic, who were rooted in trying to make their people live better lives. And they were undermined by bringing in these ideologues and these terrorists and these dictators from afar. And by the way, Natan Sharansky wrote an amazing thing 3 weeks after Oslo, saying that unless we start working with the Palestinians and start helping them build civil society, to bring in another dictator isn't going to help, because ultimately the dictator needs what you said, the enemy, the common enemy. So we have to start thinking smart. And when I say we, I mean not only the Israelis. Everybody's really good at throwing the Israelis under the bus and saying what their limits are. Let's look in the mirror, my friends. Let's look at where the American foreign policy establishment is so ideological and so blind to so many subtleties and nuances. It's actually terrifying when you think of how many tens of millions of dollars we spend on these experts and how the Washington Post keeps on quoting the same 10, 20 people, and they're always wrong.
Gil, we have about a little bit less than 15 minutes to wrap up. Why don't you tell us, as somebody who lives in Jerusalem, who writes for publications yourself, just a few weeks ago, a bunch of us rabbis in Miami had lunch with Richie Torres, and he said that TikTok is the greatest national threat that the United States faces because it's information distortion. And so many people gain their information through a completely distorted media landscape. Where would you recommend, if you wake up in the morning, all of us do the same thing, we wake up in the morning and look at our cell phone, the 2 or 3 platforms that you'd recommend that we look at in the morning?
Well, thank you. So let me go deeper first before I give you the answer, which is that, to build on what you're saying, I think we're failing our kids. If we don't teach our kids those critical thinking skills, and by the way, that's one of the crazy problems that's happening in the universities, right? Because universities, too many, especially humanities departments, have become these propaganda factories. The most important thing I learned in university was critical thinking, how to sift through different arguments, how to learn with different people who might be wrong, I might disagree with, but I can go back and forth and have what Martin Buber called an I-thou. We don't have enough I-thou education. And so as important as it is, in this holy day school you have, and in Milken and Shalhevet and all the amazing schools you have in Los Angeles, as a New Yorker, I never realized how many amazing schools you have in this one small area. It's extraordinary. One of the things you really have to work on is not just Jewish identity, not just Israel awareness and Israel identity and Zionism, but also just critical thinking skills. So that when they can encounter A, TikTok, and B, a propagandistic professor, even if they decide to go along to get the A, which is legitimate because we all have to learn how to work in a system, that's a skill set too. But to be able to smell the distortion, smell the perversion. And I don't think we've done enough as a Jewish community to take that on as a responsibility. So sorry for, but in terms of what I do is, I'll give three different answers. One, as I said, in American politics, I still read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. But by the way, there's a big difference between the Wall Street Journal front page and op-ed page, and that's always very interesting to see. And that's one of the things, my kids know that they see me reading different newspapers when they were kids, right? And I would say, oh, look at the same thing, this headline, that headline, that headline. And they'd understand that headlines are distortions. They've seen sometimes I've written an article, and then some editor puts a headline on that I didn't see, and I'm annoyed because it didn't reflect. Now, sometimes I'll push back, but usually I don't because, life is short. But they're part of a process, because they have a nerdy dad, about understanding that the structures, the stories, the narratives of TikTok are sometimes distorting. But again, as I said, I go to Real Clear Politics because I like it's simple and easy, and I see left, right, left, right. I read The Atlantic. That's for my American politics. For Israel, I've found Tablet very strong. I found commentary very strong. And in terms of getting just basic Israel news, online I read in English Times of Israel and Jerusalem Post. I go back and forth between them during the day. And every morning I read the Jerusalem Post to get a sense of kind of what the Anglosphere is talking about and read some of your excellent articles, including one recent. I read Haaretz to know what the enemy is thinking. No, to know what the other side is thinking, because I need to be in an I thou, because they're my brothers. I don't cancel them. And believe you me, every week I want to cancel the subscription, but I don't, because I want to learn from them, and I want to be in conversation with them. And as I said yesterday, I read Yediot Achronot. It's an Israeli tabloid, which gives me the nitty gritty of the eulogies and the letters from the front, and Yediot Achronot. And it actually has an English website. It's called yediot.co.il or something like that. So that's my short answer. Because we're running out of time, allow me to summarize, if I may. And I'm happy to stay afterwards and speak informally. So again, I just want to thank you, because I'm going to go back to Jerusalem, and I'm just going to tell my friends about this amazing jewel of a congregation. I'm going to tell my friends about this amazing experience I've had in Los Angeles for the last 36 hours. Friday afternoon, I sat with 8 young influencers who are exactly the young people we complain about. That generation, they don't care. They care so much. They feel so betrayed by so many of their friends, and they want to figure out how to move forward. I spoke at Loyola Marymount University on Thursday night, and when I said what I said to you about propagandistic professors, it broke my heart to watch young students shaking their head. Yes, that's what they experience. I wanted them to go, no, Professor Troy, you're wrong. It's not true. I knew it wouldn't happen. But we have to have a sense of outrage for that it is happening. And these 2 young heroes came up to me afterwards, and they wear a Jewish star. And I said, did you pull it out for this lecture? They said, no, we walk around wearing that Jewish star. And I said to them, my kids, last night, I'm happy to talk about my heroic kids who are far braver than their dad. I said, my kids have a certain kind of heroism, but you have a heroism too. Every time I speak to young American students, Jewish students, I say, the spiritual heroism that it takes for you to stand up and wear a hostage tag, or wear a Jewish star, or wear an Israeli t-shirt, in some ways it requires more heroism, courage than my kids. Because when my kids come home, everybody gives them the Hebrew word firgun. Kol hakavod, attaboy, you're fantastic. And here these kids are paying $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 at Tufts University, where I spoke, $84,600 a year to feel at risk because they put out their Magen David. It is unacceptable. And it's a consumer issue. I call this educational malpractice. So that's summary number 1. Summary number 2 is I just want to share with you my favorite page, which is my least favorite page, which is page 2. I call this ugly facts for an ugly war in an ugly world. And when Oxfam says that Gaza is the bloodiest conflict since 2000, I'm a nerd. I'm a historian. I said, well, let's look at the 6 bloodiest conflicts and see that most of them involve horrific suffering of 300,000, 500,000, a million, 30,000 is a rounding error. That's not to minimize the loss of each human being. But put it in context. I know that word's not so popular after Claudine Gay, but you got to put it in context. Genocide? Genocide in Hebrew is retzach am, the murder of a nation. The Palestinian population under quote-unquote Israeli occupation has quintupled. It's actually 5.5, it's going 5.5. We're the worst genociders in the world. And look what genocide really means. Civilian deaths in wartime? Look at our numbers, and of course they're such ugly numbers, 9 to 1, 7 to 1. But the fact that 15,000 Hamasnikim have been killed, and then if so, it's 15,000 innocent, quote unquote, innocent Palestinians, that's too many, but it's in urban warfare, we have tunnels and chaos, it's going to be taught in West Point for years. And then I go back to Mosul. So all these are just little facts. The little fact that we withdrew in 2005. What do you want from us? The little fact that everybody's so quick to judge us. Give me an alternative of what would you do? We were talking about this. What would we do in Southern California if narco gangs came up from Mexico and did unspeakable things in San Diego? Would we distinguish and we can't go into Mexico at all because the Mexican government condemns it? In this case, the Mexican government didn't even condemn it, the equivalent. I don't think Israel should be better than anybody else. But I don't compare Israel to Syria. I just compare Israel when it's fighting to the United States of America, to England, to Canada. Let's just hold Israel to that standard. And then I want us to try to be better. But first, just take that base acceptance. But I want to finish with an attempt to summarize these last few sessions. One of the things that so betrayed me on October 7th was the reaction of my colleagues, the academic world, my feminist colleagues, from whom I've learned so much over the years, who've taught us so much about zero tolerance for sexual violence and gendered violence, who've taught us so much about the need for equality. Look at the difference of the world that I went into when I went into Harvard in the early 1980s and today. There have been tremendous strides. But on October 7th, that a history professor from Cornell University could get up and say he was exhilarated. And then, when he was forced to apologize, he said, I apologize for my words. What about your tone? What about your tone? In May 2021, over 200 gender studies departments signed a petition denouncing Israel as sexual violence when we were simply defending ourselves against Hamas bombardment. I had a project for 2 Hartman's interns, and they went through every one of those departments. Not one of them said anything about what happened. But as I said last night, I chose not to look at any of the videos. I have some friends who watched every one of the videos because they wanted to feel the pain and be empathetic. I understand that. I wanted to protect my soul. And so I also struggled about going down south. But I finally decided I need to go down south. I need to see, I need to feel, I need to talk to people. And it was very illuminating. And after a very long day, I end up in the Nova site. And those of you, I don't know if you've been there or seen pictures, but they have metal poles. And on every metal pole, simple metal pole, is a picture or 2 pictures. And you assume, oh, it must be both sides of the same person. No. Each picture is a different person. Each side. So it's 360 young souls singing, dancing, enjoying themselves, murdered there, and 30 others. And we know one young man, Ben Mizrahi, from Vancouver, who was there, who was a close friend of my son's, who made Aliyah, who ended up fighting like a lion and trying to save people and was killed, which returned me to my Zionism. And it's remarkable. You look for the picture, and there, in a sea of 360, 180 poles, there are 40 yeshiva bachers standing around praying for Ben. And I joined, and the rabbi said something extraordinary, because he was a great rabbi, and we know that a great rabbi has to understand where his or her flock is, just like a great teacher, just like a great leader has to understand where your people are coming from. And so this rabbi said, now that we finished praying and singing, I want you to go up and down and look in the eyes of the pictures of every single one of those people who fell. And then he said something extraordinary. He said, look, we all wear uniforms. We wear a black and white uniform. The soldiers over there, they wear their khaki uniform. Those party goers wore their uniform to a party. Don't judge them by how they were dressed. And what was he really saying? Don't judge them by how they were undressed. Because I said he was a great teacher, he was a great rabbi, he was a great leader. He understood that these yeshiva kids, 18, 19, would go, oh, she's sleeveless. Oh, he has 32 tattoos or 17 earrings. No, he said, don't look at that. Look in their eyes and understand that every single one of them died for you. Every single one of them, including some non-Jews, died al Kiddush Hashem, died a martyr's death. Every single one of them is holy. Every single one of them is us. And unfortunately, he left, so I didn't have a chance to meet him. But I thought, wow, we can't undo history. We can't undo October 7th. But if we can learn from it, if we can lean in to the suffering, and from there, love one another, learn from one another, be united with one another, then it'll all have been worth it. And you are part of the future. You are part of the tikkun. So thank you very, very much. I'm Yisrael Chai.